This is a very surreal moment. I can't believe the four of us are in a room recording at General Assembly. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, this is the first time, I think even this week, that the four of us have been together in the same room.
Because Kyle's too scared to be seen by you guys, with you guys.
We're enemies of the state.
So, TJ, I met you for the first time, I think, about a year ago. And for the last year, we've been trying to figure out a way to not just get you and me in the same room, but get my dad and Kyle Hackmann in the room with us to do an episode. And it worked out with the timing that we did that this last week at the denominational General Assembly meeting in Richmond, Virginia. What made you feel like it was worth your time to do that?
Well, it was great for the four of us to all be in the same room together for the first time ever. And we got to have a couple of meetups with listeners. That was a lot of fun. And watch the PCA General Assembly show. It was a fun sociological experiment, just watching those guys do what they do. So overall, it was a good trip. And I mean, it would have been worth it if for no other reason than the four of us recording what people are going to hear in this episode.
Right. I think it was great to sit down and recap what we've learned over the last year, which is a lot. And also just to check in and see how my dad and Kyle, who are still pastors in the denomination, feel about the denomination and how it's handled the case. Do we also want to just, before we get into the episode, briefly mention there might be movement from the seminary on how they want to handle this case?
Yeah, at GA, we heard that President Tom Gibbs said something to the effect that they're going to be doing some kind of annual memorial service around the time of Elizabeth's death every year going forward to remember Elizabeth and also to remember other people who have passed or other tragedies in the PCA. So, I mean, we had kind of heard that through the grapevine, no specific details, but I think that's great, although we'll have to wait and see what, if anything, they actually do.
Yeah, so it was helpful to hear that. Well, and this is the last episode.
Yes, this is the last, we'll say, it's not even really a reported episode. From the very beginning of this project, I always envisioned that the final episode would be the four of us in the same room together, kind of debriefing the series. And serendipity, it worked out that the timing of GA this year was perfect. Kyle and Doug were going to be together anyway, so you and I flew in. And I think what we recorded ended up being less of an overview. It's not like the whole series condensed into one thing where we review all the suspects, and that's not really what this is. It's more the four of us talking about the experience of working on this project, what Kyle and Doug experienced as pastors going through it, what they're going to take away going forward, you as a journalist, what you learned, me as, the first time I've ever worked on anything like this. And in some ways, we responded to some of the things that we've heard, some criticisms that we've received, feedback that we've received. So the four of us just kind of talked through that together. And I will say, from a production standpoint, we recorded this in our Airbnb, so the audio is a little more echoey than I would like and not as clean as normal.
Nobody's going to be able to tell the difference.
I can tell the difference. And also, I had not accounted for the fact, so, GA is a lot of late nights and early mornings. And because of the schedule, we could only do this very early on the last morning we were all there. And I had not taken into account the fact that we would all sound like we had just woken up because we had just woken up. So apologies if our voices sound a little off.
My voice is pretty scratchy, but it's okay. It won't be the first time I've been criticized for my vocal fry on this podcast, and I'm sure it won't be the last. Yeah, so, we wanted people to just listen. It's a little bit of a reaction episode. You can hear us address some comments and critiques, including ones that we were getting in real time at General Assembly. And so hopefully it also helps you understand why we did what we did, and then you can decide for yourself.
I don't really think my views of the PCA changed because of this significantly, or my views of the, this Presbyterian Christianity that we practice changed. I think I had a pretty robust and clear understanding of how sin works and the way institutions kind of depersonalize actions and encourage sometimes poor responses and sin to flourish. So, I had no problem saying that. I never thought for a second the PCA was perfect. And as the institutions get bigger, I had already seen some of the underbelly and could say, yeah, I have no problem saying I'm participating in part of an institution that is going to regularly have to expose errors that need to be fixed. So I wouldn't say that much of that changed. I would say a couple of things that have really surprised me is how intense loyalty works in the denomination. Some people that would count as close acquaintances have raised criticism about the podcast without having listened, which to me would have been something I would never have expected a PCA pastor to ever do. I always found this denomination to be the one that, rather than criticizing Harry Potter, makes seminarians read Harry Potter and evaluate. And there's very little that's off limits to listen to, watch, read, and evaluate. And it has been utterly shocking for me to see people scared to listen because they're scared their loyalty might be called into question. And they've been encouraged subtly not to listen, and people choose that path and yet still talk about the podcast negatively. That's been the surprise to me. You don't have to listen. I don't care. That it might not be good to listen for a lot of people. That's been surprising. What consequences has it had for me as a minister? Well, my wife, said the exile of 70 more years, just like the Bible, we're stuck in Canada. I've had to do some very serious soul searching about whether I lack discretion. And as a human being, I would say it's probably something that I still am wrestling with. To know the right thing to do and not do it is a huge sin. But also to not be able to shut your mouth is a big problem. So do I lack discretion? Are my motives pure? And there's been some moments where I've almost overanalyzed and tormented myself about how pure my motives might be. At the end of the day, an older pastor actually told me just yesterday, just let the Lord judge. You're going to be all right. I would say this time last year, I had an encounter with an individual who was very against the podcast, gave me a list of 3 things that couldn't happen, which would prohibit the podcast from rolling forward. I felt like all 3 of those things were taken care of nicely, and still there's no response. And I definitely felt a heightened nervousness as I walked into the assembly hall around who's watching me and who might corner me again. On the whole, I don't feel like it's harmed my future in the PCA, though. Maybe, if anything, it's strange to hear people talk about the pod, to see people take selfies with my friend TJ. That's very weird for me. So on the whole, I don't think it's hurt my future in the PCA, but maybe related to the future of the institutions, I might not have the ability to shape or participate in that future. I would also say that podcasts, while I'm not surprised that at the way sin works, especially in institutions, I have had my eyes opened more clearly to the way in which you pull on a thread and all of a sudden you start to watch portions of the sweater unravel. And I had no idea some of the background drama that was going on in the PCA and at Covenant Seminary. I had no idea that in the last 30 years how much there had been conflict going on. That was in no way part of my intentions. I cared about why no one spoke of Elizabeth, why the Creve Coeur Police Department seemed to think there's something fishy that went on. Those were my driving motivations. It's been very difficult to find, as you tug on one thread, to see the sweater come undone. And I would just say, to me, this has been a good exercise in why the discipline of journalism exists and why there does need to be some measure of pastors staying in their lane. Some of the initial criticism we received isn't wrong. We don't have the skills. We also ought to be careful about how we report on things that are hard to decipher. And it's been good to see Ruth in action, even if it means some things that I value about the case are not deemed to be factual enough. And I feel like my theories start to get questioned a little bit more intensely. It's been good for me, and this practice for me has been an absolute 100% supporter of good journalism. And I read journalism differently now. And I acknowledge that there's a chance, journalists have to write about me. But in some senses, I would hope they would be as fair as I've witnessed, Ruth especially trying to be. And so that's another thing that's changed. Is I've just found myself kind of loving good journalism that's very careful, very careful with people's reputation, but also very careful with the truth, and wants things brought into the public, into the light, so that people can do better in the future, make better decisions.
I totally agree, Kyle. And adding Ruth was game changer for sure. I think what happened was people pre-decided what this was going to be before, and some of that was because I was involved in the project, and apparently that's problematic for some people, which is fair. But then that pre-decision that it's going to be pretty much us sitting around chit-chatting about who did the murder, and we're going to throw out theories, but knowing that that's not what it is. But there was a definite lack of curiosity about what are you guys doing? What is it going to be? It was just, we're going to tell you what we know it's going to be. And that set sort of a stage of against itness for a project that people have been speculating about this for a long, long time. And people have been throwing out theories for a long, long time. But as long as it's over beers, it's not slander, apparently. But once you start recording people, it makes everyone way more nervous. And that has been, in my opinion, disappointing, although understandable.
I think your point's a great one, Doug, though, that the accusation of slander that's come our way in sometimes very formal accusations and sometimes a lot of informal, no one's making that when people were talking about it on private groups, when they were having beers. And in some senses, we have to ask ourselves why. Like, why is one permissible and the other is reprehensible? And I'm still somewhat confused by that. I feel like nothing was said. There were so many rumors that I had heard about this case that never made it to see the light of day in this podcast because they probably are factually untrue or they're just not verifiable. And this, you'd think the podcast is a service to kill those kinds of conversations, but it wasn't. And that's been somewhat disappointing, the subtle blindness, it seems, to conversations over beer being permissible, conversations with a journalist, trying to verify, trying to fact check, questioning narratives, seem to be skeptical. Now, I will say in their defense, there's some historical things that happened. First off, TJ, I love you, but the trailer was not geared towards engaging the audience that maybe you wanted to entice to take an interview. So the way the trailer was released, if anyone's in entertainment or listens to podcasts, that's a great trailer. I'm excited to listen to it. If your number one goal was to entice certain people to take interviews, the trailer failed to accomplish that goal. If it was to get downloads, I think you accomplished the second quite well. So I would say I understood some of the nervousness. Even after the trailer came out, I remember a sinking feeling in my stomach a little bit of like, oh boy. Because I don't know what everyone knows, but I basically dumped what I knew to TJ and Ruth, and we would occasionally talk, but I wasn't holding hands through the whole process. You weren't asking my opinion about anything. I was often hearing this stuff just a couple hours before everyone else did, and I had a busy life, so I'm sometimes listening to it, at 2x speed while I'm doing something else. So this was often a surprise to me as it rolled out, and I will say there were times where I wondered if I shouldn't have trusted you, but I'm very thankful for the work you did, and like I said, I appreciate journalism in a different way after this experience than I did before. I also think there's a huge historical event that happens that changes why this podcast happens. And that is that I happened to be at this seminary doing something related to church planning when Cold Justice is filming the next week on campus. And the letter got circulated and a staff member was surprised to find out there was a murder on campus, a staff member. So there was this sort of surprise that there'd been a murder and that there was a true crime show coming. And I actually was thrilled because I thought they'll do good work. And then my burden for Elizabeth and also to clean up the reputation in some senses to the Creve Coeur Police Department, which I had some ins with, that can be accomplished through a Cold Justice episode. And I was very excited for the Cold Justice episode, and I was very convinced that I would sleep better once this got released. My conscience wouldn't be troubled about remembering Elizabeth. And after watching the Cold Justice, And seeing no one from our denomination participate, whether that's on the shoulders of the cold justice or someone else, I actually don't know.
It was conspicuous.
It did not help me sleep better. It didn't. And also, I felt there was just so much missing about the story that they didn't discuss. And they were very glib about very serious allegations and accusations. And so when that happened, at that point, I thought, one, if anyone says this is slander, there's a TV show that's out in the public sphere that says the same names, but does kind of a second-rate job in investigating and reporting. And not really mine to judge, but I'm guessing this is kind of second-rate. I kept referring to it as true crime porn. It was just grotesque for people that are into this stuff. And I thought, after seeing that released, how can you say this is slander? Because in some senses, you're telling the story correctly and better and in a more healthy way. And so that to me, the trailer set this thing off on an unfortunate trajectory, in my opinion. But cold justice also set this thing off on an inevitable result in someone else having to do something, whether it was us, you two especially, or whether this was an outside journalist. Someone's going to pick up on cold justice and run with it. My thought was that the denomination would be nervous, but somewhat thankful that someone with an into the denomination, some love of a common faith, wants to be a part of it. I thought that would be encouraged. And I've been a little bit surprised because I think had this been picked up by a journalist with a real axe to grind, not just a minor axe to grind like TJ and Ruth, but a real angry axe, and to the point that you could feel it, there's a lot of things that could have been covered that the police talk about that they could have made sort of a mountain out of a molehill. Little speculations here or there that are salacious, that are great for getting clicks. But because you guys had some measure of passion and dignity to tell the story well, I really appreciated how it ended up rolling out. And I assumed that others would say, this is much better than some other journalist who has no knowledge of covenant coming in and digging deep, and playing dirty and speculating about things out loud with no fear of God. My assumption being that this would be pushed forward in the right way.
I would just like to say, I don't have an axe to grind.
We all have axe to grinds, Ruth. Don't be so naive.
Yeah, my point is similar to that, Kyle, that this was going to happen. There's no way TJ is not doing this podcast for sure once he gets on this. And so isn't it better to have two PCA pastors involved to help talk about it or to give perspective on that's not exactly the way it works?
Well, the episode that people were most upset about, episode 7, you guys both heard the first edit of that episode, and you, I think, freaked out is probably the right way to say it. And you helped shape that episode, and I think crafted into something much better. And Kyle, I've had many people this week tell me how thankful they are for the perspective you brought to that, and help them think about things they had never thought about before.
I want to ask you guys, so that definitely was the episode that was not the normal one. I went back and re-listened to it a couple of days ago and had a new appreciation for it. So just now that you've heard the pushback, but I'm assuming the pushback is mostly from PCA pastors and not from the rest of the world. So how do you sort that out?
Well, the challenge with this whole project is, who is the audience? Is the audience PCA pastors? Is the audience everyone else? Is the audience true crime listeners? We knew we didn't want it to just be true crime listeners. It would have looked very differently if that was the case. We wanted it to be approachable to people who are interested in true crime, who are interested in religion, and who did not have this background in this super niche, small denomination. I felt like, as we were reporting on this episode, we made the decision that we wanted it to be pretty closely focused in on Elizabeth Mackintosh and what happened at Covenant Seminary in 1990, and then related to the case moving forward. A pretty narrow focus. I didn't want it to be an expose on the PCA or an examination of everything the PCA has done since 1990. But as we were talking to people, so many people were telling me their own stories of the PCA, good and bad. And it seemed like a lot of people were viewing this project maybe as a chance to say, and a hope that we would look at what it felt like, especially to be a woman in the PCA, and how it feels in the last few years when the denomination has done this work to look at sexual abuse and domestic violence and spiritual abuse. And so I would tell people this project isn't really about that. But we also hit a point where we felt like we had to kind of acknowledge that it did feel related to many people, and that people did wonder, was Elizabeth Mackintosh killed because she was a woman? Was she killed because she said something about a male pastor that was viewed through the lens of gender? And I would always tell people, well, I don't know the answer to that for sure. And I know that Elizabeth Mackintosh was pretty conservative herself. So it's not like she was like the feminist on campus and then got killed because she was like quoting Betty Friedan. Like, no. As far as I know, no. But it also felt like it would be disingenuous to ignore the question at one point. And so we were trying to figure out how to incorporate all of that into one thing. And TJ and I knew when we made that episode that we were kind of damned if we did and damned if we didn't, because we couldn't talk about everything, but we also couldn't not, I just felt like we couldn't not talk about it. And that episode went through so many revisions because then we were trying to understand why you felt so uncomfortable with some of the initial edits. And then, well, okay, how can we incorporate some of these voices? Did we interview the right people? And, you know, I still don't mind the critiques of that episode, but what I will say too is journalism is not always trying to be the authoritative be-all, end-all. We were working with the people who would talk with us. And so we were trying to do the best that we could with people who we thought were, who we not just thought, who we knew were credible and had something relevant to say. I would never say that we, in any of this, had necessarily talked to the world expert on X or Y. We're just working with the people who will do interviews with us. So I'll leave it there for now.
And as an outside observer, it was my impression that it was a ratio of maybe 25-1 in terms of people from one perspective versus another that want to speak.
Oh, yes. I approached to multiple other people for that specific episode on spiritual abuse, women in the church. And again, I'm happy that Catherine Spearing, for example, was willing to talk with us. But I did also try to talk to other people. And just for one reason or another, people didn't come through.
I think that's good to document because that's part of, and I actually now see it as a bigger issue that journalists have to deal with, especially in people who've been wronged. The negative stories, they feel powerless and voiceless, so they flood the journalist. And it takes incredible discipline to not just take the whole story arc. And I was really impressed that you felt some of this needs to be acknowledged publicly, but it can't dominate the story arc. What tensions did you guys feel in terms of losing the focus on Elizabeth Mackintosh? You talked about the various audiences that could be, and you know, the true crime junkie that just wants it all about the investigation, and the PCA hurt person wants it all about the institution. I felt one common denominator we all had, though we each had our own little lens at how we looked at this project, was her memory was not remembered well. Was there ever a time in the story arc where you felt it was being pulled too far outside of keeping a focus on making sure she's remembered well?
Well, part of what we were trying to do with this project this is why I say I've never really considered it a true crime podcast, because yes, we are telling Elizabeth's story and telling the story of the murder, but we're also talking about these larger issues and how Covenant Seminary dealt with it, how her memory has been handled by Covenant Seminary in the PCA. And so there are some of these larger contextual issues that aren't directly about her murder, but that we felt like are part of this bigger story. And so, for example, yes, I agree with everything Ruth said about episode 7, but also I would say, even if you put all of that aside, I think the best rebuttal that I can give to people's criticisms is just listen to Liam Adams' final comment in that episode, where he talks about, I had asked him, do you see any connections between these issues we are raising, the issues that he, Liam, has investigated, things in the PCA, and the murder of Elizabeth Mackintosh? And he said, yes, there are these connections. It wasn't specifically about abuse in the PCA, but it's more about how does Covenant and the PCA handle difficult issues? And there seem to be connections between the way that they handle difficult issues in 2023 and 24 and how they handled a very difficult issue in 1990. And these things are connected. And so we're not saying Elizabeth was killed because there's issues in the PCA in 2024. We're saying there's a cultural, the way you deal with hard things. Kyle, what you talked about, what do gentlemen talk about and what do gentlemen not talk about and how do they talk about it? As we got into those couple episodes that were talking more about the cultural stuff and not specifically about the murder, I think we felt like those were things that needed to be talked about. We tried to keep it as connected to Elizabeth as possible and then try to get back into more of the police investigation and the things directly connected as soon as we could. But I think it would have just felt weird to not address some of those things because some of the questions that were being raised and just natural things that played out as we're learning about the police investigation and learning about how Covenant handled things. The other thing that I'll say is that listeners heard this in a linear way. They hear episode 1, then they hear episode 2. What I think maybe people don't, they probably realize it when I'm going to say it, but like all of the things, episode 14 about David Weinkoff and his death, we've known about that for 18 months or whatever. And so we have sort of known that there's going to be this bigger arc and that these issues of the PCA and how they handle difficult things and all of this, that like stepping back and seeing the bigger arc, that's sort of a part of the story. So even though it felt tangential to the listener at the time because they didn't know what was coming, we knew what was coming. And it felt like that was a piece of the story that needed to be covered.
And the other thing I'll say too is I don't know who killed Elizabeth Mackintosh, and I don't know why they killed Elizabeth Mackintosh. But when we opened some of those doors to the cultural questions, we were also still hoping that some people would talk to us who could close those doors. And if they won't talk to us, then I think the question remains open and valid of are these cultural issues in 1990 or in 2024 still preventing this case from being solved? And I think that's a perfectly valid question. If some folks that we've tried to talk to who could address that won't talk to me.
Could I ask, do you think those cultural values have affected Elizabeth's memory and how
Yes.
her death is reflected?
So while she was a conservative woman herself, this is my opinion. This is just my opinion. I do think that because she was a woman, because she was not already a pastor who maybe had a network of people to speak for her, I don't think it was intentional that people forgot about her. But there was just I don't think there was ever a real effort to remember her as a person.
Which is surprising. Church history is all about the martyrs. There's a long history of remembering people who died, both poorly and well. And one of the questions on that episode, having listened to the whole story arc, kind of understanding a little bit more of your project, then the second time I listened to it through the lens of why is her memory not present when you're in this denomination? Such a tragedy. Almost nothing compares. There's a couple other major tragedies in the PCA, but very little compares to how horrendous, sad, and disgusting and horrible this is. And I wondered, as I listened to it the second time, if part of why you took that approach was because we all had this kind of common goal to remember Elizabeth well, and something in the culture that was hindering good memory of Elizabeth. It was my thought as I listened to it the second time.
When I re-listened to the episode, that came through loud and clear. The second time, the first time, because we heard all these other first cuts, and we're like, oh. But the larger point is something that I think we started with at the very beginning is I don't want to make Elizabeth Mackintosh a metaphor, but there is this metaphor of how do we deal with tough things and this institutional inertia to not talk about it. And I just have been continually disappointed with the lack of fervor to do whatever we can, not only to solve the murder, but to talk about her. I mean, I was on the board, and it was just always like, oh yeah, okay, we got this. We'll get to it. And there's a lot of reasons to not get to it because there's a lot of other stuff going on. There's crises. This doesn't feel like one to Covenant. They got a lot of other stuff to do, and there was a pandemic, and there was a new president. But it's like, yeah, but we've never done these things. When are we going to do it? What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? Let's get to it as fast as possible, not as slow as possible, because the not mattering of this is very evident. And I think for us, Kyle, like, we're on the inside and we're thankful for the PCA and proud of the PCA and embarrassed by the PCA. So we sort of have this apologetic a lot of times, like, okay, yeah, but listen, here's why this is happening. But when you're an outsider, what is your view of the PCA and these institutions is a whole different question, right? And Ruth grew up in the PCA, but we are like, oh, okay, be careful, because, these are our friends we're talking about. It's not the same perspective. And I've had to deal with that for sure, right? Go for it. Be journalists. Don't just be PCA fanboys. I'm not exactly one either.
I mean, my neighbors are listening to this. I live in Toronto. They don't have a clue what the PCA is. They don't have a clue what Covenant Seminary is. And I've had profitable conversations with them. I don't think people expect institutions to be perfect because of some profession of faith. I think they understand that institutions are dicey. But it did help me see the subculture that are emerging within Christianity, especially those who might be on the conservative end of the spectrum, are a lot more than just differences in doctrinal distinctions, but also differences in how we talk about domestic violence and abuse and the processes we put in place for these things. As I spoke with my neighbors, I started to realize I was kind of I code switched with you guys as it related to the denomination and to the seminary, but with them, I realized there's even greater cultural barrier between. This was utterly foreign to them, that this wouldn't be well remembered in such a small seminary at the time, and so it was always interesting to me to see how much of that was happening. Can I ask a question? I know you have your journalist. I want to know what the number one piece of feedback you received was, and if there's any feedback you never received that you were expecting. What do people constantly reach out and you feel like you've heard the same story over and over again? And was there something you were expecting to hear that you didn't ever hear?
The most common feedback that we've received has been from women. I'd have to go back and count. I don't know if it's over 100 at this point. Dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of women who contacted us, especially after episode 7, saying, thank you for raising these issues. This has been my experience. This tracks with what I have experienced in the PCA, and I'm either still in the PCA or I've since left. But thank you for telling my story in some sense. And so that has been eye-opening.
My favorite feedback has been from pastors' kids who grew up in the church, and then some still go to church and some don't. And it's made me think a lot about how, I would say it's good for kids to grow up in the church. If their parents are believers, you want church to be a good place for kids to be also. But when church is not a good place for kids and they didn't have a choice, and situations like the one that Michael's kids, Carl and Kirsten, went through just totally wreck their lives, and they have to figure out how to rebuild as adults. I think that's really powerful stuff that I hope people really consider. Feedback that I have not gotten, one of the things that's kind of irked me for the last year is when people give you guys, Kyle and Doug, feedback, and I never hear a single thing.
Right.
And there's some of that that's understandable because you're known entities, and of course they're talking to people they know. You can tell me if you want to keep this in, but it also feels disingenuous to me and kind of political.
Oh, 100%.
Totally.
If you're TJ and I are the people in control of this project, and if you really want to give feedback about the project, you should talk to me. And I think if you're not willing to talk to me, you don't actually care about the outcome. You're just trying to influence the project. And maybe somebody's listening and they're like, whoa, like that's an accusation to throw around. Okay, I'm just saying that's how it's felt.
Ruth, that's really good. And I've been trying my best to pass some feedback to you. But with the permission of people who gave it, I
of course
would say, I'm going to pass this on to TJ and Ruth. But it's interesting for me how much they don't want their name tied to this feedback. They don't want any record of them asking this question. I found it incredibly frustrating. And some of the, we'll just call them accusations, mild threats that came after me, it's amazing how few of them are willing to put these things in writing and actually back up what they're saying. And I felt I was trying to push these things to you guys because I wanted to make the project better. And I wanted you to know what voices were saying. But at some level, you're right. It felt like people were talking about you guys behind your back. Don't for a second
That's exactly what it felt like.
Don't for a second believe, though, that they thought this was really Doug and my project. They knew we were liabilities at some point rather than assets.
Well, I always tell people I don't know what I don't know. And if you don't tell me what you think and what you know, I cannot take it into account. I just can't. And there's also things people have told us that they've wanted to keep off the record for various reasons. But whenever we have that conversation too, I always tell people, I cannot use this if you tell me I can't use it. I take confidentiality so seriously, but that also means it won't be in the project. And so people have to there is a ton of trust that goes into talking to a journalist. And I know I need to build that trust and earn that trust. But there are things that I wish we could talk about in this project that because people have not been willing to directly talk to me on the record, it's not been published. And I just would encourage anybody listening this far, we're an hour into this reaction episode. Hey, maybe it's time to pick up the phone and say what you know.
And what do you think, though, about some people have said that when they have talked to you, we've heard that you or we tricked them into being interviewed or what they were being interviewed about. And so we're not to be trusted.
Again, it's interesting that is coming third hand to you instead of directly to me. It's not something any of our sources have ever said to me. Is that right, TJ?
Yeah, no one's ever reached out and said, I thought this was one thing, but you tricked me and used a different thing.
And I had that one in writing because Covenant faculty forwarded emails saying, is this true? And I think if they would have known you, they might have forwarded it to you, and they're probably not going to go on a website and put
I understand
there, but I want to make sure that's on the record. Now, do you think it's possible some people regret things they said after it having aired?
I mean, anything's possible, but people that we've interviewed, first of all, they sat in front of microphones, and some of these people said things that we haven't aired. That if people think like we're just all about being salacious and airing ridiculous gossip and slander and trying to get clicks, if people heard things that we haven't aired, I think that criticism would go away. Like, we have exercised extreme discretion and judgment, I think, in what we have held back. And yes, no one that we've interviewed has contacted us and said, whatever, based on what I'm hearing in the podcast, I think that this project was disingenuous and I want you to, I'm withdrawing my participation.
No,
No
not
one has,
at all.
no one has done that.
Well, and the way that this works too is often people talk to us and then it's a few months or longer before something airs. And so I could envision a conversation where someone says, "Oh, I kind of forgot I said that." And then, okay, I mean, that's totally fine. And then maybe that gets twisted a little bit into, "I didn't mean to say that." And then that gets twisted a little bit more into, "Ruth and TJ tricked me." And I'm just guessing, but I have seen that kind of play out in other things that I've worked on. But it's disingenuous to say that Ruth and TJ tricked anyone. That is not true. And there are cases too where people have talked to us and then have later withdrawn an interview. And most journalists would not let you do that at all. But we did, because we respect some of the people who needed to make that decision and understood why they wanted to do that. And so I don't know how angry I sound, but that questions, all I have in journalism is my name. And to question my name and to question my work without even the courtesy of saying that directly drives me crazy.
It was also pre-decided that people have done everything they can do with the police. And it's really frustrating when you hear that lectured to you, when you know there are interviews where the police disagree with that. I know there are police that do not agree, but I'm still hearing we've done every single thing we can. I'm not saying they haven't done everything they can. The police is saying. Now, Kyle, we've also heard that we're promoting a big cover-up. And we've all talked about...
That you're promoting a cover-up, or that you're saying there was a cover-up?
Yeah, that there's a cover-up, and we haven't said there's a cover-up, right? You even talked recently as, I don't know that Covenant Seminary has any documents to give over. I believe that. So I don't think there's for sure a current cover-up. And I don't have any way to get to a past cover-up unless people say there is one.
Every time I've seen tragedy break out in a church or scandal break out in the church, the first piece of advice that I received from an older minister once was, "You're going to lose. There's no way you can win after a scandal breaks out. So lose with your head held high. Your reputation's going to take a hit. Grow character through this." That's always been the advice I've lived by through these things. And I stand by what I said in the podcast. Covenant was in a lose-lose situation. And I think they followed legal advice. And to their credit, that is actually what I talk about in episode 7, somewhat staying in your lane. If I don't believe there's a cover-up, but if there's any cover-up, it's almost a cover-up of omission, a cultural not talking about this cover-up that I don't think is intentional. I don't think it's thought out.
Not currently, for sure. Not currently, for sure.
I mean, just generally, I just think this is how things have been handled for so long. And I wonder at some point when that crosses over to a line of being wrong. I don't think there was any malicious hiring of a PR firm to erase memory. No, not for a second. And in fact, I know that some people who were there at the time still think about this regularly. That's the irony of them being some of the people who are upset about the podcast writing to me in their email. You could tell they have trauma that they still haven't really dealt with well. So I don't think there's any cover-up. I do think there's a culture that just doesn't know how to deal with these situations that are lose-lose. There's no way to spin it to look good. And it's just a tragedy.
And that's what I think too, Kyle. So this happened with Koistra and Chapel, and they had a posture toward dealing with this, which makes a lot of sense, especially in the moment. But then the posture just keeps going. So, in the moment, the year later, the 2 years later, they didn't do a service. They didn't erect a memorial. They didn't do a scholarship. And it's understandable. They're still dealing with it. But then that just gets inherited by the next administration. And there's a lot of stuff you got to do whenever you change presidents. And then it gets inherited again, right? And I give myself blame too, because I didn't care about this when I was at Covenant. I didn't know about it. I learned out about it a year or two after I graduated in 2001 or 2. And I didn't go like, where's the memorial? Where's what are we doing? It took me a long time to finally start asking these questions. But then you're asking these questions to an institution who's got other stuff to do. But the inertia of that just keeps going forward.
TJ, to get personal and uncomfortable, because we're friends and you have editing power, so who knows if the world will ever hear this. One accusation that I received, which is interesting, as a general principle, they said participating in this encouraged this sort of deconversionist movement. This is there's a trend in society and you guys encouraged it. You gave them more ammo for why they're walking away from the faith.
Because we're encouraging people not to trust the church, so to speak? Or?
Well, I don't know that they felt the need to describe to me exactly why that happened, but they just said, this is a trend. Everyone is angry towards the church. They air their dirty laundry, and that is encouraging young people to walk away. Now, these are people over 50 mostly that made this criticism. And people a little bit younger saw this as very helpful to talk with. My neighbors are not believers. I mean, I have a neighbor that has pretty much told us won't walk through the door of a church, but is listening. And this is a provocative conversation for them. And I can't help but think, whatever I believe about Jesus Christ, as crazy as it might sound to my neighbors, I also care a lot about the truth. And I want that to come through in this particular project. So TJ, I know a little more about your faith journey. You don't need to share it publicly in whatever way you have, but you've sent me texts like divine intervention happened, and this couldn't have been a coincidence. How has your faith been provoked, challenged, stimulated through this project?
Yeah, in the first episode I said, my faith journey is complicated, but I feel like I've been called to this project. And so I don't attach any specific metaphysical, maybe it's the Holy Spirit has put this thing on my heart, maybe it's the life force of the universe, or it's, whatever. I'm an Enneagram type 1, and so I want justice, and I want the truth to come out, or whatever it is. For me, all I can say is I know that I have been called to do this thing. And so for me, what's been less important, it hasn't been as important to identify where the call is coming from. It's been important for me to obey the calling and to follow it. And so, yes, there have been things along the way. I've tried not to fall into motivated reasoning and confirmation bias, because I was having a conversation with one of the pastors the other night about this, that history is filled with people who felt they had a divine calling. And that's produced a lot of wonderful, beautiful, awesome, historically significant things in the world. And it's produced a lot of awfulness and bloodshed and death and horrible, some of probably the best and the worst of humanity has been tied up in people feeling a divine calling. So I'm trying to be careful with that and not put too much weight on it. But there have just been numerous circumstances through the course of this project that have just felt like, keep going. You're on the right path. Keep going. Keep going.
What about Christianity specifically, though? I mean, to me, and it came out in some of the episodes, I think Ewan's episode, to me, Christianity tells this somewhat unique story where the majority of the scriptures are not flattery as it relates to who God's people are and how they act. And yet, even in being uncomfortable talking about not flattering stories, I still think that Christianity highlights, yes, that's exactly the very people that are in desperate need of experiencing shalom, of experiencing harmony in the world and peace and order and justice. And has your specific opinions towards Christianity, the story that God's Son comes into the world, dies, that there might be order and peace and justice might flourish, and that there might actually be forgiveness for people who are, in some senses, such abject failures, it seems wisest to just throw them away. Has this story gripped you in any new way through your experience of reporting and discussing this crime?
If anything, it would be a negative. I mean, literally tattooed on my arms, I have the truth will be heard, and Pilate's question from John 18:38, what is truth? Like the quest for truth is the central focus of my entire life. And so it feels like if any community should be about the truth at all cost, the truth as an end unto itself, and let the chips fall where they may, that these would be the people who would recognize that and say, it doesn't matter what comes out, or it doesn't matter who looks bad or whatever. Now, you don't air all your dirty laundry. You don't, okay, every email we've ever sent, we're just going to make public so people can see, but I don't think that Ruth and I have said anything that's untrue. We have told people's stories through their own voices. In the very few places that we have speculated, it's been based on facts that people have given us and logical conclusions that have followed. I don't think there's been wild speculation and innuendo. And
if we learned there was an error, we would also correct it.
So can I summarize what I'm hearing you saying, though? You're and I think you're being careful about it out of kind of respect in our friendship and because it's public, but you're saying the witness of Christianity and your experience of Christianity has been frustrating because you're someone who cares deeply about the truth. This project is tied to caring about the truth. And you've experienced some people who don't seem to mind that the truth has been obscured. And yet they have data points that could bring the truth to clarity. And it's made you call into question, aren't these the people who are fine saying we're sinners, or fine saying that we're absolutely broken and sort of beyond repair individuals, but by the grace of God? And if that's true, how come there's a nervousness and an instinct to object to the truth coming forward? This has negatively impacted your view of Christianity. Is that true?
I think, or maybe just further confirmed what I've suspected for the last 8 or 9 years. But I think even less than the specifics of the PCA, I have had I already knew this, but I just had a renewed appreciation for the sense that institutions will protect themselves at all cost. And it's not necessarily a malicious thing, or whatever. People, they have this thing, they've built it, they don't want to see it go down. And so, but institutions will circle the wagons and protect their own. And there's almost an involuntary rejection, like an immune response to somebody asking hard questions. Well, that must be an antagonistic virus that we have to violently attack and get rid of.
But what about all the people that have thanked you for this? And I especially think there's something of a generational gap of people who say, this has been helpful for me.
That's huge. Yeah, that's been one of the most surprising things that's come out of this project, is that most of the people who have been critical and upset about what we're doing are from an older generation, and most of the people who have been very encouraging and supportive and thankful tend to be younger. Now, there's overlaps in those two groups, but there's a huge generational divide. And it makes sense because our generation, and even, Gen Z, is just like, say all the things all the time in public, air everything. And that's not how things were handled in 1990.
Well, and one of my points to Covenant has been, this is helpful to recruit students.
I think that it's the opposite of what those people have been telling you, that this is a project that's going to encourage more people to leave the faith because it's just airing these bad things and it's going to confirm. I think it's the opposite, that the people who are leaving are saying, we just want the truth. And you're obfuscating that. And I think that if these institutions came forward and said, we made mistakes, we acknowledge that, we can't change anything about what has happened in the past. All we can do is change how we handle things going forward. I think people in these institutions are afraid that would be used as leverage against them to say, aha, they admit they made mistakes, so let's take them down. I think people acting in good faith would say, thank you for admitting that. How can we all move forward together in a healthier way? That's what the people who are leaving want and aren't getting.
And if I can add on, when I say some of my favorite conversations out of this project have been with pastors' kids, I have reconnected with some people that I grew up with in the church, including some pastors' kids, who have said this level of discussion about what the church did wrong is something that I personally have been just torn apart by for years, connected to some things that maybe happened to themselves individually. And I never felt like I had any way to talk about it, and that no one would listen, that I would not be believed, and that Christians don't care. And so some of them are still believers. Some of them have walked away. But this project, I don't think, would be anything that would make someone walk away. This project might provide an avenue for people to talk about why they walked away. And I hope that's something people are willing to pay attention to.
And the idea of not doing this project would only all the more confirm the decision to walk away. Doing this project has reinforced some of your negative stereotypes, but I guess what I heard you say is that you've also heard people say, this is encouraging.
Yes.
You know, and if the Christian faith is going to survive the post-Twitter, post-Boston Globe, post-Houston Chronicle world where everything does get exposed, we have to find a way to be comfortable through tears, with regret, to talk about these things. And at times, actually, with just lament, to say we just don't really know how to move forward in a healthy way, and that's fine. But the worst thing to do is to pretend like it never happened for our generation. Maybe Doug's out of the picture, but for Ruth and TJ, my generation, it was that was one thing that I was really curious about, and I've been withholding asking you that until we could do it on here.
I do have one extra small question. How many hours does an episode take?
Yeah, it's a good question. You should.
It depends on the episode. I'd say it's a little hard to say because I'll do an interview with someone.
How many hours have you worked? I know you have this number.
Yeah, how many hours is on your little app?
Well, minus, I haven't accounted for the hours of this trip so far, but right up to this trip, it's about 1,200 hours. I've worked on this project the last 18 months.
How much money have you made?
I've made $0. I've spent
negative.
I've spent thousands of dollars of my own money on the production of this thing.
And I haven't spent as much time as you have because you're doing the actual production, but then add my time to that number.
Yeah, thousands of hours that we've put into this thing. And I should say, I've loved every second of it. If I could get someone to pay me to do this full time, I'd quit my other work. Sorry to my clients if they're listening, but I would quit that work instantly and do this for a living. I love it.
Well, who did it? Just kidding.
Well, if journalists don't answer, because Ruth just pretends like
Silence.
silence.
She has no opinions.
Pastors ought to double not answer.
I don't think that's a useful question, Dad.
I was kidding.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, maybe just briefly, let's say, Ruth, why do you think it's important for us to not... maybe some people were waiting for this episode because they thought, okay, finally, they're going to just lay out their whole theory of who they think did it, which we're obviously not doing. Why is it important for us to not do that?
Yeah, somebody told me recently, and I've also gotten some similar emails of, oh, I just listened to all of this and I still don't know who did it. You've just dragged me through 20 hours of speculation. And the point is that life has no easy answers. And again, if you want a true crime podcast, you can listen to a true crime podcast. This is also a podcast about truth and lies and trust and how we tell stories. And I'm not going to try and do that in 30 minutes. Yeah, I'm not going to tell you who I think did it. And I also would say my opinion of who I think did it has changed as we've worked on this because we've learned new information. And that's important to say. I was even talking to somebody last month who I thought might help me put the murder on one person. And that conversation also changed my mind. So, I mean, I would just come back to also, that's also the importance of people being willing to talk to us. Like, I truly do take their information into account. And it helps me connect the dots that I haven't before. And I think the bigger picture of why this is important is establishing the most comprehensive picture we can of what happened on March 26, 1990 and after, and establishing the public memory of Elizabeth Mackintosh and keeping respect for her as a person and her faith and what she wanted the church to be. And yeah, I'm not going to just give all that away by saying, oh yeah, I think it was this guy, if I don't know that for sure. That's not my role. Also, I will say, lots of people have also asked me, if you think somebody in the church messed up, why don't you take it to court? And I'm like, what do you mean?
Take it to the church court.
Or take it to actual court, take it to the police. And that's just not the role of journalism. Like that again plays into just some fundamental misconceptions about the role of journalism. It's not my job. My job is to bring information to the PCA. It is the PCA's job to decide what to do with that information and how to police itself from the inside, or, if the case may be, from the outside in civil courts. But that's just not what I'm here to do.
Well, I was very encouraged to hear police officers say, this is a solvable case. And we've said at the very beginning, we weren't trying to solve the case, but this is the way to get it solved, is if people know what everybody else knows. And when, obviously the police didn't talk to everyone who knows a piece of information. And there has to be some spot to put all the marbles so someone can sort through the marbles and look at what they are. It's very clear, as we knew at the very beginning, and Kyle, you were on this early, was not understanding the denominational matrix, which is complicated. I don't,
You mean the police didn't really understand
the police didn't understand what was going on, and cold justice didn't understand what was going on, right? And part of the reason they didn't understand what was going on is because the seminary allowed them on campus, but then they didn't participate in the story, which makes sense. But somebody eventually has to talk to more people and then aggregate that info to have any shot. But when the police say it is solvable, well, I'm hoping it'll get solved. I don't know how that's going to happen unless people tell what they know. We've heard so many stories about people that have little tidbits. And of course, the natural reaction is, I don't want to share my tidbit unless I'm asked. And even when I'm asked, I don't really know if my tidbit is gossip or slander or true. And so people don't want to share all their stories, but eventually that's the way it's going to happen unless someone confesses to the crime.
I think, as a way of kind of concluding, ours is a world where there's kind of two extremes going as it relates to justice and injustice. In one extreme, it seems like this is the only world that is. There's no outside, sort of being watching over, and therefore we must do everything we can to get justice. And this story is a reminder to us that our world is laden with stories that just don't end well, that just don't have a beautiful ending. And as a backlash to the people passionate about justice and who seem to be doing everything in their power to fight for justice, because if there's no justice here, then there's no hope. There's another side that maybe over-spiritualizes things and says, the Lord will make right, therefore we don't need to talk about these things or fix these things. My hope for the podcast is to say the Lord is making things right. The Lord will indeed make things right and is making things right, and therefore it's worth talking about hard things, exposing stories where there's not good endings, fighting and working hard for justice, abuse survivors, and at the same time, still being able to sort of sleep at night without literally becoming undone. It seems to me that some people who get passionate about this story, I've even felt it in my heart, that you just get cold and you say, well, there's just no hope. So why would I ever read another story like this again? Why would I ever explore anything like this again? It's just a recipe for more heartbreak. And to me, it's a time in which I say, I think there's a greater hope. I think there is a God who will judge. I think this God is merciful. I think he's gracious. And I think he will make all things right. But that is not an invitation to do nothing. It's an actual invitation with joy to spend all your life trying to do something good without losing hope, without growing cynical. So to me, the conclusion of this case for me is a reminder that this world is, in a sense, like a cloud or a mist of smoke. It's like a vapor. It's vanity in a very real way. And yet one person rose from the dead and sort of transcends this order. And so to me, if that's true, then there's hope to keep exploring these stories. It's no excuse to ignore or give up or just become frustrated, cynical, and become pious. I think it's a good call to keep fighting and working to tell the truth.
Do you want to tell people what you told me before I left for the airport?
I don't remember. What did I tell you?
You told me you loved me.
Oh, because I do.
I love you too, TJ.
Thank you.
This has been an interesting journey together, hasn't it?
It's been a pretty wild ride. Yeah, I don't really know what to do with my life now that I'm am done with this. The last couple of years, this has been the main focus of my life, more or less. So I'm going to have to play a lot more pickleball or something to fill in the time. I guess we should say we do have some bonus episodes planned in the near future. We've got some additional content, some leftover stuff, hopefully some new content that we're still working on. And we should also say that there are
potential leads that we are working on, and if we find new information that seems relevant to the case, you and I both plan to publish what we can publish.
Sure. So if you're a subscriber, stay subscribed, please, because we'll have more content coming. But this pretty much, I really don't know what to do or how to wrap this up or what to say. It's just sort of weird because there's always like, okay, and here's the next thing that we'll queue up for next week. And really, this is kind of it. So, yes, Ruth, I feel tremendously blessed that you became a part of this project. I couldn't have done it without you. And I think we made a great team.
100% same in the opposite direction from me. You made this thing work, and I think maybe a reasonable way to end on it is that, again, we hope that people's takeaways are about Elizabeth Mackintosh, and we think that this is a solvable case, so if we get any new information about the case itself, we'll plan to publish it. So keep listening, keep sharing. The more people who listen and are interested in talking to us, the better.
True Believer is written, recorded, edited, mixed, and executive produced by TJ and Gracia. Co-written and co-produced by Ruth Serven Smith. Research and development by Kyle Hackmann and Doug Serven. Visit truebelieverpodcast.com to see additional materials related to each episode, or to get in touch with us. If you're someone who knew Elizabeth, or have any information related to her or her murder, we'd love to hear from you.